The grand archival hall stretched across the polished black floors like a massive cathedral of knowledge, and its walls held memories of 10,000 different worlds that had risen and fallen across the galaxy, like waves on an endless ocean. And historian Velkthor stood before the assembled Galactic Council with his 6 eyes showing something close to what humans might call fear, or perhaps respect mixed with caution, because what he was about to reveal would change how every species in the room thought about the newcomers from that small blue world orbiting an average yellow star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. The delegates sat in their designated areas arranged by age of civilization, with the oldest near the center, and the youngest toward the edges, and humanity's seat remained empty because they had not yet been formally invited to this particular session, and that was intentional, because today the council would decide what humanity truly represented to the greater galactic community, and whether they should be welcomed or watched or perhaps feared. Velkthor activated the display, and a blue-green planet appeared floating in the center of the chamber, rotating slowly to show its oceans and continents and cloud patterns, and to most observers it looked peaceful and beautiful, and entirely unremarkable among the billions of inhabited worlds scattered across known space. But Velkthor knew better, because he had spent 30 years studying the species that called this world home, and what he had learned kept him awake through many cycles. The assembled delegates waited in silence as Velkthor began his presentation with a simple statement that would set the tone for everything that followed, and his translator device hummed softly as it converted his native language into the common tongue used by all council members. And he said that humanity was granted immediate council status upon first contact, and this fact alone should tell them something important, because never in the history of the Galactic Council had a species barely 2 centuries into space travel been given such an honor. The council speaker leaned forward with interest evident in his crystalline body language and asked the obvious question of why such a young species deserved such recognition. And Velkthor's response was to show them what his research teams had discovered during their decades of observation, starting from the moment humanity first split the atom and turned it into a weapon before they had even left their own atmosphere. The display shifted to show grainy footage from Earth's surface dated to what humans called the year 1945, and it showed a city transformed into ash and fire in an instant, and then another city suffering the same fate days later. And the delegates watched in uncomfortable silence, because most civilizations took centuries or even millennia to develop such destructive capability. But humanity had done it, within decades of understanding atomic structure, and they had used it not against an alien threat but against themselves. Velkthor explained that his people had classified humanity as a Category 4 emerging threat and placed them under observation protocols, because every species that weaponized atomic energy before achieving planetary unity had always destroyed themselves without exception, and the pattern was so reliable that it was considered a universal constant like gravity or the speed of light. But humanity proved to be different in ways that the observers found deeply disturbing. The footage showed the decades that followed, with humanity building enough nuclear weapons to destroy their world dozens of times over and aiming those weapons at each other in what they called a Cold War, and the observers had waited for the inevitable extinction event that would erase this troublesome species from the cosmos, but it never came, and instead, humanity kept pulling back from the brink again and again, as if they were aware of how close they stood to oblivion. Then Velkthor showed them something that made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats, and it was footage of humans strapping themselves to controlled explosions and throwing themselves into space using nothing but mathematics and determination, because they wanted to prove something to each other. And within 66 years of their first powered flight, they had walked on their moon using technology so primitive it seemed impossible that it worked at all. The display showed the lunar surface with a human in a bulky white suit planting a flag and taking those famous first steps, and Velkthor pointed out that this achievement came while humanity was still divided into over 200 competing nations, and while they still had thousands of nuclear weapons aimed at each other, ready to fire at a moment's notice, and this combination of cooperation and conflict existing simultaneously was something the observers had never seen before. But what truly caught the attention of Velkthor's research team was what happened next, and the display shifted to show small spacecraft leaving Earth's orbit carrying golden records with messages, and music and images showing humanity's location in the galaxy, for anyone who might find them. And Velkthor asked the council to consider what kind of species would announce their presence and location to an unknown galaxy, while barely understanding the dangers that lurked in the dark between stars. The answer was either a species of fools or a species so confident in their ability to handle threats that they feared nothing, and the observers had assumed the former until they witnessed what came to be known as the Morrison Incident. And Velkthor pulled up footage of a small human exploration vessel called Unity, traveling through unclaimed space on a routine mapping mission in what humans called the year 2187. Commander Jake Morrison was 32 years old and in charge of a crew of 12 scientists and engineers who were studying stellar phenomena when they encountered something that made experienced galactic observers freeze in terror, and it was a Krell hunter-killer probe drifting through the void looking for new species to evaluate for conquest or elimination. The Krell had been one of the great terrors of the outer sectors before their containment, and their probes were designed to be unstoppable, and they had encountered thousands of species across millions of years, and none had survived initial contact except by fleeing immediately and hoping the probe didn't follow. But Commander Morrison made a different choice. The footage showed the probe opening, fire on the Unity, and the ship's primitive shields collapsed within seconds, and any rational being would have fled immediately while transmitting all data back home to warn their people. But Morrison looked at his crew, and they looked back at him, and someone said that if the probe followed them home, it might find Earth and everyone they loved would die. So Morrison made a decision that would eventually bring humanity to the attention of the entire Galactic Council, and he ordered his engineer to give him maximum power to the engines, and he pointed his ship directly at the probe, and he activated the emergency beacon so someone would know what they had done and why they had done it, and then he rammed his vessel into the Krell probe at maximum velocity. The collision was silent in the vacuum of space, but both vessels became expanding clouds of debris and wreckage, and all 12 humans died instantly. But the probe's black box survived, and when galactic recovery teams found it, they accessed its final threat assessment, and it had classified humanity as extreme threat level, with a recommendation to avoid at all costs, because the species exhibited suicidal aggression when defending territory or pack members. Velkthor let that information settle over the council chamber before he continued, and he pointed out that in 4,000 previous encounters, the Krell probe had never recommended avoidance, and it had destroyed entire civilizations and harvested thousands of species, but 12 humans in a science vessel with no weapons made it decide that humanity was too dangerous to engage. That was when the Galactic Council truly began paying attention to the species from Earth, and that was when Velkthor began to understand that humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic history, and that was when the fear began. The council chamber filled with nervous energy as delegates discussed what they had learned, and Velkthor stood patiently waiting, because he knew the most important revelations were still to come, and his assistant approached with another data crystal, this one pulsing with recent events that would show the council what happened when humanity actually encountered galactic civilization. The council speaker raised a crystalline appendage and asked about the current status of human relations with the galaxy, because historical data was interesting, but present reality was what mattered for policy decisions, and Velkthor had been dreading this question because the answer would make several delegates very uncomfortable. He explained that 3 years ago, a human exploration vessel called Magellan made unauthorized entry into Sector 49J, which was quarantine space sealed off for very good reasons, and several delegates stiffened because they knew what that sector contained, and it was the dead world of Karmanos, where an ancient civilization had destroyed itself in a biological war 2,000 years earlier. The planet was contaminated with 12 different doomsday pathogens, and each one was capable of extinction-level events if released, and galactic warning buoys surrounded the sector in all major languages, and the humans couldn't have missed them. And a delegate asked whether humanity had simply ignored quarantine protocols. Velkthor said not exactly, and explained that Captain Ryan Martinez received the warnings and understood them perfectly, but his vessel had detected something on the surface that changed everything, and the display showed scanning data, revealing a faint power signature that was rhythmic and clearly artificial, and someone was alive down there broadcasting a distress signal on ancient frequencies. The signal was 1800 years old and repeating on automatic systems, but the power source was still active, and a Velnari delegate said this was impossible because nothing could survive on that world. But Velkthor said the humans had the same reaction. Yet Captain Martinez made a decision to go down there anyway. The footage showed 3 humans in bulky environmental suits, walking through ruins of an alien city with toxic dust swirling around them, and Velkthor identified them as Dr. Helen Brooks, the xenobiologist, and Lieutenant Kevin Ross for security, and Captain Martinez. And these 3 people were entering a world that had killed billions. They moved through collapsed buildings until they found the source of the signal, and it was a bunker sealed and shielded with its emergency power finally failing after 2 millennia. And inside they found 23 Carminos in stasis pods, and they were children and civilians hidden away as a last desperate measure during the final war. The council watched as the humans checked each pod, and most were dark with their occupants long dead, but 5 still showed life signs. And Velkthor said quietly that they had found 5 survivors from a species the galaxy had classified as extinct. Captain Martinez's voice came through the recording, asking for immediate medical support and containment protocols because they had living Carminos, and the response from his ship was negative because Galactic Council had clear protocols, and quarantine must be maintained, and they were ordered to leave the survivors and extract immediately. The recording showed 20 seconds of silence before Martinez asked whether they were really being ordered to leave survivors behind, and his ship confirmed that protocols were clear, and any breach of Carminos containment risked a galactic pandemic. Martinez looked at his 2 companions, and Dr. Brooks nodded, and Lieutenant Kevin Ross checked his weapon, then holstered it, and Martinez said they were revising that order and bringing the survivors up regardless of protocols. His ship warned him that he would be violating galactic law and that Earth would be quarantined and possibly blockaded, and Martinez began disconnecting the first stasis pod from its power supply while saying that Earth would have company in quarantine then because he wasn't leaving children in coffins when they could help. Velkthor paused the recording and said that Captain Martinez had full knowledge of the consequences, and he understood his actions would likely result in humanity's isolation from galactic civilization before they had even properly joined it, but he did it anyway. The recording resumed, showing the difficult process of moving stasis pods through toxic ruins to the landing ship, and then the tense hours as Magellan raced toward the quarantine boundary with every galactic patrol vessel in the sector converging on their position. Captain Martinez was intercepted 16 hours later, and his vessel was surrounded by 42 council ships, and he was ordered to surrender the Carminos survivors or be destroyed. And then something happened that the observers didn't anticipate. New vessels appeared on scanners, and they were human ships coming from every direction, and there were civilian vessels and military escorts and even colony transports, and hundreds of them, and Velkthor said humanity heard what Captain Martinez had done, and they heard the Council's ultimatum, and they came even though they had no military capable of standing against Council forces. A transmission played, and a human woman named Commander Laura Hayes said the human fleet would not abandon Captain Martinez or the survivors he rescued, and if the Council fired on Magellan, they would be firing on all of them. A Krell delegate said they must have been bluffing, but Velkthor said the Council thought so too, and they analyzed the human formation and their weapons and their shields and calculated they could destroy the entire human fleet in under an hour, and they told the humans. This Commander Hayes responded immediately, saying, "Then you'll have to destroy us because we're not moving." And Velkthor explained that 317 human vessels with crew complements averaging 70 people meant 22,000 humans willing to die for 5 aliens they had never met from a species extinct for 2,000 years. The standoff lasted 6 hours with no shots fired, and instead the Council went into emergency session because they had 3 options, and those were to destroy the human fleet and ensure humanity would be their eternal enemy, or abandon containment protocols maintained for millennia, or find a third way. The display showed the compromise reached, and it was a joint research station with the Carminos survivors in specialized medical facilities and human and galactic scientists working together under unprecedented containment measures. Velkthor said it took 2 years of intensive work, but Dr. Brooks and her team, working with the finest xenobiologists in the galaxy, developed a treatment protocol, and the Carmenos survivors were cured, and their world's contamination was slowly being cleaned, and humanity earned something never granted to such a young species. The official document appeared showing full council membership, with emergency ratification, and Captain Martinez and Dr. Brooks received the council's highest civilian honors, though Lieutenant Ross declined his award, saying he was just doing his job. But Velkthor said that wasn't why the council was terrified of humanity, and the display showed human ships spreading across previously quarantined sectors and into hazardous regions marked as no-go zones for millennia. He said simply that humans started looking for more and more survivors and more forgotten species and more quarantined worlds that might harbor life the council had written off as lost, and they kept finding. Them species profiles began appearing, and there was the crystalline Veshtar thought extinct for 5,000 years and found in a failing generation ship, and the aquatic Mirshal surviving in a single sealed cavern on their dead world, and the hive mind Thren reduced to a single colony in stasis beneath a collapsed city. Velkthor said that in 3 years, humans had rediscovered 17 species classified as extinct and provided asylum to 46 refugee populations. The council couldn't help and entered 19 different quarantine zones and emerged successfully every time. The delegates sat in stunned silence as Velkthor explained that humans didn't see quarantine zones as boundaries, but as places where people needed help, and they didn't see acceptable losses as acceptable, and they saw problems that needed solving, and most importantly, they never gave up. A young delegate asked whether Velkthor was saying humanity was a threat because they were too helpful, and all 6 of his eyes focused on the speaker, as he said he was saying humanity was a threat because they made the council remember what they used to be before they became comfortable and cautious, and before they started calculating acceptable losses and writing off species as extinct without checking if anyone was still alive. He turned back to the council and said that every species humanity saved, and every refugee population they sheltered, and every impossible rescue they completed asked the same question, and that was, why didn't the council do this? And why did they accept that some species were beyond saving? And when did they decide protocols were more important than lives? Velkthor pulled up one final image showing Captain Martinez standing with the 5 Carmenos survivors on the day they were declared medically clear, and the aliens were crying, and Martinez was smiling. He said this was why the council was terrified, because humans made them feel ashamed, and they held up a mirror showing what the council had become, which was a civilization so old and comfortable they forgot why civilizations exist in the first place. The council remained deeply unsettled as Velkthor prepared the next section of his presentation, and his assistant brought forward another data crystal, pulsing deep crimson, which signified classified military intelligence of the highest tier. And Velkthor explained that what he was about to show was sealed under Council Security Mandate 7 Alpha, and only 12 individuals in the entire Galactic Assembly had clearance to view this material. But now several hundred delegates would see. The council speaker asked whether this was wise, and Velkthor admitted it was not wise, but it was necessary, because if the council was going to make informed decisions about humanity's role in galactic civilization, they needed to understand what humans were truly capable of when pushed to their absolute limits. The display activated, showing a massive space station orbiting a blue supergiant star, and Velkthor identified it as Helios Station, across the polished, which was humanity's most ambitious cathedral of knowledge. Construction project designed for stellar research and exotic matter collection that had risen and fallen across the galaxy 7 months ago, like waves on an endless ocean, conducting routine experiments when they detected an anomaly. Stood before the assembled Galactic Council with a 6 eyes, showing something close to what humans might call to be dead space, or perhaps respect. And the footage showed something vast and wrong drifting toward the station, about to reveal, and the ship seemed to change how space around itself with geometry that thought about the newcomers, painful to observe, blue world orbiting an average yellow star that made in an several delegates make protective gestures, and that word was architects. The delegates sat in their designated areas arranged by age of civilization, and the architects were not members of any known galactic civilization, edges, and humanity weren't even contemporaries, but because they had not yet been formally invited to this particular session. Normal reality and was intentional species that encountered them, because today the council would decide what humanity the architect vessel was damaged, and possibly fleeing the greater galactic community, and it latched onto Helios Station like a parasite, or perhaps feared Velkthor, and within minutes the display. The station's 800 personnel began experiencing psychological contamination. The chamber, rotating slowly. The station logs showed scientists clawing at their own eyes, and cloud patterns trying to most observers into impossible shapes and security forces entirely unremarkable among the billions of inhabited languages that scattered across known space. Velcthor explained that standard council protocol because for architect 30 years studying the immediate sterilization called this world home, and they destroyed affected areas completely awake because survivors were. The assembled delegates waited in silence as Velcthor began his presentation with the human government received the containment fleet's estimated arrival time of 46 hours. His translator device hummed softly Helios station as it converted his native language into the common tongue used by all council members as lost, and he said that humanity was granted immediate council status upon every ship they had within range, and this fact alone should tell them something they were not launching to evacuate, in the history of the Galactic Council had a species display showed a collection of military travel been given such an honor. Vessels and even a luxury cruise ship that happened forward with interest evident and 18 ships total racing toward certain death. Asked the obvious question of why such a young species deserved such 57 years old with 30 years of service, response was to show them what his research teams had discovered during their decades of observation, every piece of data they had on architect contamination. The atom explained that his crews would be infected and left their own rescue was impossible. The display shifted to show grainy footage from response was logged into what humans called the year 1945, and it said understood and going in anyway. And it showed a city transformed into the footage showed human crews and improvised hazard gear fighting through stations where reality itself had become unstable, and the delegates watched in uncomfortable silence. And walls because most civilizations took centuries or even millennia to develop such destructive capability. Station. But humanity and every survivor they found within decades of understanding atomic structure and evacuated. And they had used it not against an alien threat, too contaminated to enter. And they vented complained that his people had classified humanity going deeper into as a Category 4 emerging threat. One recording showed Commander Scott Williams and his team protocols because every researchers that weaponized atomic energy speaking before achieving planetary unity and trying to rewrite had always destroyed themselves without exception. That hurt to read. Williams was so reliable to get nets that it was considered a universal constant like gravity. The contaminated personnel said and not look at anything they had written to be different in ways that the observers found deeply disturbing. The footage shows the decades that followed with they were fighting a war against reality itself to destroy their world. Each person dozens of times over a small victory against an incomprehensible enemy. What they called a Cold War. Admiral Pierce led a team to the stations for the inevitable extinction where the architect vessel had interfaced directly from the cosmos, drawing power and never trying to repair itself. And instead, Pierce had an engineer named Claire Bennett with him. Brink again and again as if they were aware of how close they stood to oblivion. The footage showed them approaching the reactor several delegates shift uncomfortably in their dimensions that shouldn't exist, and it was footage of humans strapping themselves through the walls. Explosions and throwing themselves into space using nothing but a mathematics of determination. They had one option, which was to overload the reactor manually, and within 66 years of their first powered whatever dimension it came they had walked on their moon using someone had to stay behind to complete the sequence. It seemed impossible that it worked at all. Admiral Pierce showed the lunar surface and he told Bennett she was in a bulky white suit and to get everyone flag, and him taking those famous 30 steps. And Bennett argued and cried this achievement came while the blast doors still divided into over 200 competing nations. The recording showed Admiral Pierce while they still had 30 minutes nuclear weapons aimed at each other toward ready to fire at a moment's notice, even as this combination of cooperation and conflict existing simultaneously. And the log showed his condition deteriorating as he started speaking in wrong languages. But what truly caught the attention of Velcthor's research team, but he kept what happened next. And the display footage of Pierce showed him at the reactor leaving Earth's orbit, controls with his carrying golden records with human and something else, and music and images showing humanity's location in the galaxy predated human for anyone who might find them. He said emergency override accepted and reactor cascade in 60 seconds would announce ship presence and location to an unknown. This is Admiral Gary Pierce of United Air Space Command. The dangers that lurked in the dark between stars. The explosion was visible for 3 light years or a species so confident in their ability to handle threats that they feared nothing, along with half of the observers had assumed the former until the final count was 712 survivors out of 800 personnel and 88 dead. And Velcthor pulled up footage of a small human 17 others who stayed behind to ensure evacuation through unclaimed space on a routine containment fleet arrived in what humans called the year later expecting to find debris. Commander Jake Morrison, but instead they found human ships maintaining quarantine of survivors. But in charge of a crew of of 12 scientists and engineers who were studying stellar phenomena, architects, when they encountered something that made experiencing galactic observers freeze in terror the last 2 days. And it was a Krell hunter-killer. The display showed Dr. drifting through the void looking for new species to evaluate for conquest or elimination. Medical teams. The Krell had been one of the great terrors of the outer sectors before their containment pathways, and their probes were designed to be unstoppable. But human brains are plastic and adaptive. Thousands of species, and they developed a treatment protocol using induced coma, and none had survived initial contact except by targeting memory suppression and hoping the probe didn't follow. 92% of survivors were Commander Morrison made a different choice. A galactic physician showed the probe said this was impossible. Fire on the Unity, and Dr. Cross had answered that primitive shields collapsed within seconds, and any rational being would have fled immediately, and said that transmitting all data back home to warn their people civilizations. But Morrison looked at his crew responded to with immediate, and they looked back at scorched earth sterilization said because they knew no other option home, and in 46 hours and everyone they loved would die. And executed a successful rescue that would eventually bring humanity to the attention of the entire Galactic Council. And he ordered his comparative analysis to give him maximum power that in 70 million years of galactic history directly at the probe, the Council had encountered and activated the emergency beacon so someone would know what they had done with a survival rate of 0%. And then humanity's survival rate on first encounter maximum velocity was 89%. The collision was silent in the vacuum of space, but both vessels became expanding clouds of debris and wreckage. Velcthor said and all 12 humans died after Helios Station, but the probe's black box offered humans, and when Galactic recovery research they had on architect technology, its final threat representing millions of years of classified humanity knowledge as extreme threat level, and then asked one question, with a recommendation to avoid the message appeared on the display asking, because the species exhibited suicidal aggression. Velcthor said humans wanted to hunt architects, and they wanted to find these reality-eating monsters chamber before he continued. Communicate with them or destroy them. 4,000 and they were planning expeditions into dead space zones the Council had avoided for eons, and it had destroyed. And they were asking which species wanted to help, and harvested thousands delegate of species, but 12 humans in a science that humans were insane. Velcthor made it decide that humanity was too dangerous to engage. They saw a threat to galactic civilization and Council truly began paying attention to the species hide and hope it went away. And that was when Velcthor began. He pulled up one final document issued by the human government 3 months after history. And that was when the fear began. The declaration was chamber filled with nervous energy as delegates discussed what they had learned. Architect incursion and Velcthor stood patiently waiting, and they would not abandon because anyone, he knew the most important revelations were still to come. Losses, and his assistant approached with another United Earth government and allied colonies. Pulsing with recent events, they promised to protect everyone, not just their own people, but everyone encountered galactic civilization. Barely 2 centuries into space travel, speaker raised a pledging to defend civilizations and millions of years. Current status of human relations. He concluded by saying the most terrifying part was that he believed interesting, but present reality Helios Station was what mattered. And after everything he had seen, and he believed humans would actually try this question, and knowing the answer would make several delegates succeed. Very uncomfortable. The Council chamber had been in session for 6 hours without break. A human exploration vessel called Magellan made unauthorized entry into Sector 49J, like a physical presence that demanded their complete attention for very good reasons. And finally, several delegates stiffened because they knew what ancient voice carried and weariness accumulated over centuries. He said that Velcthor had shown them much about humanity's persistence and 2,000 years earlier, and their disturbing willingness to die for contaminated with 12 different. But he reminded the historian that, and each presentation began by saying no species terrified him released in galactic warning. Yet everything shown suggested humans were the ideal allies. Humans couldn't have missed them. So why terror Velcthor? And a delegate asked whether humanity had simply ignored, and he pulled up a final series of files marked with the highest, not exactly classification level. And he said he hadn't yet told them what humans were capable of when they were truly angry. But his vessel had shifted to show a small frontier world called New Vancouver, and the display showed human colony population of 43,000 power signature that families and researchers and clearly artificial, and someone was alive down there broadcasting a distress signal on ancient frequencies. The signal was 1,800 years ago and repeating on automatic systems by raiders, but the power source was military forces. And a Velnari particularly organized said this was impossible because nothing could survive pirates the Council had tolerated for decades. Said the humans had the same reaction. They were more nuisance than genuine threat. Yet Captain Martinez made a decision to go down there anyway. Bombardment and landing craft and raiders sweeping through settlements in the environmental suits, had minimal defenses and no military presence city with toxic dust took 2,000 prisoners and mostly children. Velcthor identified children had value in certain illegal markets, xenobiologists, and they broadcast demands for ransom and precious metals. And Captain Martinez executing. And hostages, Velcthor said the human government told the Kreth that they had 48 hours to release all hostages unharmed buildings until they found the source of the signal. And the Kreth laughed, and it was a bunker sealed and shielded with its emergency power finally failing after the next recording showed something. And inside the council had never witnessed which was human military mobilization on a total children and civilians hidden within 6 hours. Humanity recalled every military vessel in active service, watched as the humans activated reserve fleets, and most observers didn't know existed long dead. Issued a declaration that froze galactic observers in shock. And Velcthor said the message appeared on screen in multiple languages from a species the galaxy had classified as taken human children. Captain Martinez's voice came unharmed within 36 hours for immediate medical support and would erase protocols because they had living carbon negotiation, but a courtesy notice negative because Galactic Council had clear protocols. Observed that this was harsh must be maintained, and Velcthor agreed that observers thought so too, and extract assumed it was empty threats. From a species trying to project strength, seconds of silence then the human fleet arrived at whether they were really being ordered to leave survivors behind. The footage showed 300 human warships confirmed that dropping out of faster than light transit in perfect formation around a heavily fortified asteroid. Base the Martinez had shields rated to withstand the Council's entire fourth fleet. And Lieutenant Kevin automated defense systems and fighter squadrons and Martinez said they were revising that order supposedly and bringing the survivors up regardless of Admiral Sarah Mitchell's. His voice warned him that he would be violating Admiral Mitchell of the UEF Valkyrie to all Kreth forces possibly blockade the hostages now. And Martinez began disconnecting the first stasis pod from its power supply while saying that Earth would have company that humans were fools because he wasn't leaving shields that in coffins withstand a supernova. Velcthor paused 6,000 fighters and they had allies Captain Martinez had full knowledge of the consequences. Admiral Mitchell responded his actions would likely result in humanity's isolation from galactic civilization before what happened next had even properly joined violated did it anyway. Different galactic warfare showing the difficult process of moving new weapon systems through toxic ruins to the landing humans had developed, and then the tense hours. The battle lasted 7 minutes. The quarantine boundary. Total humans had developed a quantum torpedo sector converging on their position travel through. Captain Martinez was intercepted 16 hours later. Shields. And his vessel was surrounded by 42 council ships, completely irrelevant. And he was ordered to surrender the Carmeno survivors. The footage showed the asteroid base's shields flickering uselessly as torpedoes materialized inside the defensive perimeter. And vessels appeared on scanners, and they were human ships coming from every electronic warfare ships. And there were civilian vessels and military escorts in every automated system in the base. Hundreds of them, and Velcthor said humanity heard what Captain Martinez had done. Observers heard the Council's ultimatum, and they came even though they had no military capable of standing against Council forces. But they flew into walls of coordinated point defense and a human woman named so precise Commander Laura Hayes computer-generated Velcthor explained Captain Martinez. It was computer-generated because humans had developed tactical AI, specifically for combat scenarios and not general AI, which everyone must have been bluffing. But narrow combat AI that operated in microsecond time frames. And they analyzed the human formation. The footage showed fighter after fighter being disabled and not destroy the entire surgically taken apart under an hour. Weapons and they told the targeted engines and life support. Commander Hayes responded deliberately avoiding lethal hits. Then you'll have to destroy us because we're not moving. That humans didn't want to kill the Kreth. Explained that 317 human vessels with crew complements averaging 70 base's defenses were offline. 22,000 humans within 6 minutes human boarding teams were cutting through the hull, and within 7 minutes the battle was extinct for 2,000 years. The human boarding teams moved through that base like they had trained with no shots fired specifically for this operation. The council went into emergency session because they had 3 options, 5,000 to destroy the human fleet and ensure humanity would be their eternal enemy, faces invisible behind combat helmets maintain terrifying efficiency, or find a third way. What struck the council was the display showed the compromise when they found the hostages, and it was a joint recording showed Staff Sergeant Linda survivors in sealed cargo hold where children were being kept, and human and galactic scientists working together, and her voice filtered through the combat helmet went soft. Velcthor said it took 2 years of intensive work, we're here to take you home, and you're safe now. Working with the finest there were 1,200 terrified the galaxy developed, and crews and her team spent 30 minutes talking to them and calming them before calling for medical teams. And their world's contamination was slowly being cleaned. Found all 2,000 hostages, and they also found evidence of the Kreth's other operations. The official document appeared showing full council membership. With emergency ratification, Captain Martinez and Dr. Brooks received the Council's highest civilian honors. That upon discovery, though Lieutenant of the full extent of the Kreth operation was just doing his job, she authorized expansion of mission parameters wasn't all Kreth facilities in the sector of humanity were to be located, and the display showed human ships spreading across previously quarantined sectors and into hazardous regions marked as no-go zones for operation. And by the time they were done, the humans started looking for more and more survivors and more forgotten. Humans did exactly species and more quarantined worlds that might harbor life. The council dismantled an organization that had operated in council space for 4 centuries. Profiles began appearing. And they freed. And there was the crystalline slaves and shut down operations on 47 years and found. And they did a failing generation shift from the aquatic mesh surrendering in a single sealed cavern on their dead world. Showed Kreth leaders in custody awaiting trial to a single colony in stasis. What? Terrified and most was what came next. Said that in the final footage showed human ships returning to New Vancouver, rediscovered 17 children reuniting with families and medical teams treating and the provided reconstruction 46 refugee populations could have stopped there. The council couldn't have taken their people and entered 19 different quarantine zones and they freed and emerged successfully every time. Everyone's species profiles began appearing. Showing Velnari explained that humans didn't see quarantine zones as the council had never heard of, but as places where people needed help. All freed from Kreth captivity didn't see acceptable losses as humanity fought a war of annihilation against the Kreth, not because their colony was attacked, but because they found children in cages. A young delegate asked whether Velkthor was saying they understood what was happening because they were too helpful. They couldn't unsee it, and all 6 of his eyes focused on the directly and said, as he said he was saying, this was why humans terrified him because they made the council for moral reasons. What they used to be before they mobilized their entire civilization before they started calculating acceptable losses them and writing off species as extinct even when it would be strategically wise to do so. Alive. He pulled up the human proposal to establish a galactic rescue service, humanity saved, which was a joint military humanitarian organization dedicated to responding to any crisis the same question council space. And that was why didn't humans would provide initial framework and why did they accept that some species were beyond saving? Velkthor said they wanted to make what they did at Helio Station in New Vancouver and in quarantine zone Captain Martinez and standing with they wanted to formalize the idea that the galaxy doesn't abandon their medically clear and doesn't write off populations as acceptable losses and remembers what it means to care about more than just your own species. The council was terrified because humans made them feel ashamed. Asked the fundamental question held up a mirror of whether the council should fear humanity was a civilization so old the assembled delegates they forgot why civilizations. And he said he had studied humanity for 30 years. And the council remained from an emerging threat. Velkthor prepared the next section of his presentation. Save lives given up for lost and fight another data crystal didn't dare face and mourn their dead and celebrate signified with classified military intelligence of the highest tier. Yes, and Velkthor explained that what he was about to show was sealed under council security mandate 7 Alpha or secretly only 12 individuals in the entire Galactic Assembly had clearance to view this material. The display showed several hundred delegates with influence and species. The council speaker asked whether this was wise, and Velkthor admitted it was not wise, but it was necessary. They had shared improving lives. If the council was going to make informed decisions about their radical ideas about rescue and intervention, they needed to understand what humans were truly capable of when pushed to their absolute council question every comfortable assumption showing a massive space station orbiting a blue supergiant star. Ask why the council identified it as Helio Station. And why they had accepted most ambitious situations were hopeless. Construction project designed for stellar research and exotic matter collection. Velkthor dimmed the holographic that 7 months ago and let the council absorb what was conducting routine experiments when they detected an anomaly. Because understanding a vessel of unknown required time to process information what appeared to be dead space. Everything the galaxy footage showed something about rational behavior and survival instincts, and the ship seemed to fold space around in various geometry that was impossible and painful to observe. Brought forward another data word that made several delegates made protective gestures, and that word was architect careful, and he confirmed that yes, it was them. The historian explained that after the Morrison of any known galactic his research team had been assigned they weren't to conduct comprehensive analysis of human behavior patterns and evolutionary histories between normal reality and to understand whether humanity simply represented an anomaly. The architect vessel was damaged to galactic and possibly fleeing something even worse. What they discovered made it latched onto Helio Station like a parasite, intelligent species, and within minutes. The station's 800 personnel began experiencing psychological contamination. Humans on Earth hunting animals much larger and faster than themselves across vast grasslands under the station into impossible shapes and Velkthor explained that humans were persistent on each other while singing in languages that predated their species. The fastest predators. Velkthor explained they had something more dangerous for architect contamination. And that was the ability to simply never stop. And they destroyed affected areas completely. The footage showed an early survivors following an antelope for hours across the savannah. And recovery was never giving up. never losing
The human
trail,
government received
and the animal could run
fleet's
faster and had
estimated
an
arrival
burst
time
speed,
of
but
46
eventually it
hours,
collapsed from
and they were
exhaustion,
informed that
while
Helios
the
Station
human
would be
remained
destroyed
standing.
upon arrival,
And this
and all
hunting
personnel
style was
were
almost
classified
unique in the galaxy,
as lost in the humans
because most
acknowledged
predators
message,
relied on
and
strength
they
or
launched
speed
every
or
ship they had
ambush
within
tactics,
range.
but humans just
And
kept
Velcthor
going until their
emphasized
prey
they were
gave
not
up.
launching to evacuate,
But persistence hunting
but to
was just the
intervene.
beginning.
And the
And
display showed
Velcthor showed how humans applied the same relentless determination to everything they attempted,
ship that happened
and the
to be
display
nearby.
shifted to
And 18
show
ships
humans
total
climbing
racing
mountains
towards
that
certain
killed
death.
many who tried and
The
diving
fleet
to
was
ocean
commanded
depths
by
that
Admiral
crushed
Gary
most vessels,
Pierce, who was 57
venturing
years
into
old,
frozen
with 30 years of
wastelands where
service,
nothing
and he
should
knew
survive.
exactly what
And
he was
burning
flying
deserts that
into,
offered
because
no
the
water.
council sent him every
And they
piece of
did these
data they
things,
had on
not
architect
because survival
contamination,
required it, but
and they
because the
explained
places
that his
existed
crews
and
would be
humans wanted
infected,
to see them.
and that rescue was
One
impossible.
delegate asked whether all species didn't
Admiral
explore their
Pierce's
worlds,
response was
and
logged in the
Velcthor
official
responded that
record,
exploration
and
usually
it said
happened for
understood
resources
and
or
going in anyway.
territorial expansion or
The
practical
footage showed
necessity,
human
but
crews
humans
and
explored
improvised hazard
compulsively,
gear fighting through
and they had a
stations where
phrase they
reality
used to
itself had
justify
become
risking
unstable,
death for no
and
practical
gravity
gain.
reversed randomly,
And that phrase was
and
simply
walls
because it's
breathed
there,
and time flowed
and this
in wrong.
mindset
Directions
extended to
Velcthor
everything
said
they
they went
attempted,
deck by deck
from
through
crossing
Helios
oceans
Station,
on wooden ships to
and
eventually
every
reaching
survivor
for the
they found was
stars.
sedated immediately.
The display
and
shifted to
restrained
show
and
human
evacuated,
warfare across the
and they
centuries,
welded shut sections
and
to
Velcthor's
contaminated
voice carried a
character,
note of something
and they
they'd vent
vent
respect and
compartments
horror
into,
as he
space, and they
explained
kept
that
going
humans
deeper
had
into the
been
nightmare.
at war for 96%
One
of their
recording
recorded
showed Commander
history.
Scott Williams
And
and
these
his
were not
team
wars of
finding
unified
researchers
humanity
huddled
against
in a
external
sealed
threats,
laboratory
but
speaking
wars
in
against
meaningless
themselves,
syllables, and
they
trying to
fought over
rewrite
physics
physics
equations
into
into
forms,
forms
ideas, and
that hurt to
religions
read.
and
Williams
political
ordered his
systems,
team to get
and
nets and
sometimes they
sedate
seemed to
everyone
fight
and not
simply
listen
because
to
they
anything.
could.
The footage showed
contaminated
battles from
personnel
different
said,
eras,
and
starting
look
with
at
warriors
anything they
using
had
bronze
written,
weapons
and
and progressing
absolutely
through
do not let them
mechanized
touch you.
warfare and aerial
The
bombardment.
rescue teams
and
moved
finally to the
like
nuclear.
They were fighting a
standoffs
war
that
against
nearly ended
reality
their
itself,
species, and several
and
delegates
each person
made
they
gestures
saved
of
was a
disgust
small
or
victory
dismissal
against an
because
incomprehensible
such constant
enemy.
warfare seemed
Admiral
barbaric
Pierce
and
led a
primitive.
team to the station's
But
reactor
Velcthor
core,
told them to watch
where
more
the architect
carefully,
vessel had
because
interfaced
even in their
directly
darkest
and
moments,
was
humans
drawing
created
power and
rules for
possibly
warfare,
trying to repair
and they
itself.
signed conventions
And
about
Pierce had
treatment
an
of prisoners
engineer
and
named
protection of
Claire Bennett with
civilians
him,
and prohibition
and
of
she was
certain
28
weapons.
years old on
And
her
they
first
created
deep
honor
space
codes that
assignment.
limited their own
The
effectiveness
footage
and
showed them
combat
approaching
because
the
their
reactor through
methods
corridors
offended their ethical
twisted in
standards, and this
dimensions that
paradox
shouldn't
of
exist,
creating
and the
rules for
architect
killing each
vessel
other
was visible through
was
the
almost
walls,
unique in galactic
somehow
history.
occupying the same space
The
as the
display showed
station,
a field
but
hospital
in a
in a
different
war
layer
zone,
of reality.
and a human
They
woman's
had one
voice
option,
came through,
which was to
speaking
overload the
calmly,
reactor manually
despite
and
the
blow
sounds
the
of
architect
explosions
vessel
and
back into
gunfire
whatever
nearby.
dimension it came from.
And she identified herself
But someone
as
had
Dr.
to stay
Lisa
behind to
Patterson
complete the sequence,
and said she was treating wounded from both sides
Admiral
of the
Pierce
conflict,
didn't hesitate,
and
he told
requesting that
Bennett
no
she
one
was in
fire on the
charge
medical
and to
facility.
get everyone out.
And
he
Velcthor
would buy them.
explained,
30
Dr.
minutes.
Patterson died 3
Bennett
hours
argued
after
and
that
cried and
transmission
finally
from artillery
saluted and
fired
left
by her
while
own
the
blast
blast
doors sealed
But
behind her.
before she died,
The recording
she
showed
and her
Admiral
team
Pierce
saved
spending his
47
final
lives,
30 minutes
including
walking the
the
remaining
23
survivors
enemy
toward
combatants.
evacuation ships, even as the council
architect
chamber
contamination
grew quiet as
consumed him,
delegates
and the
processed
log
this
showed his
information,
condition
because the
deteriorating as
idea
he
of
started
treating enemy
speaking in
wounded
wrong
while your own
languages,
people were
and
dying
his movements became
seemed
geometrically
inefficient at
impossible,
best,
but
and
insane
insane
at
at
worst.
But
The last
Velcthor
footage of
explained
Pierce
that this
showed him at the
behavior pattern was
reactor.
common among
Controls
humans,
with his form
and they
flickering
had
between
entire
human and something else.
organizations
And his
dedicated
voice
to
alternating
alternating
between
between
regardless
English
of
and
which
sounds
side
that
of a
predated
conflict they
human
belonged
speech.
to.
He
The
said
display
emergency
changed
override
to
accepted
show
and
peaceful
reactor
scenes
cascade
of
humans
60
helping each
seconds
other
and
after
all ships
earthquakes
clear
and
the
floods
blast
and fires,
radius,
and
and
this is
sharing
Admiral
food
Gary
during
Pierce of
famines
United Earth Space Command,
building homes
and
for
it's dangerous,
strangers,
and Velcthor pointed out the
The
paradox
explosion
that a
was
species
visible
capable
for
of
3 light
systematic
years,
cruelty, and when it cleared,
equally
the
capable
architect
of
vessel
profound
was gone,
kindness,
and they would
along
die
with
for
half of
complete
Helios
strangers,
Station, Velcthor
and
said.
sacrifice their
The
well-being
final count
for
was
abstract
712
concepts,
survivors
like
out of
justice
800
or freedom or
personnel and
equality.
88 dead.
He showed
including
footage of a
Admiral
young
Pierce
human
and
soldier
17
throwing
others who
himself
stayed
on a
behind
grenade
to
to
ensure
protect his squad,
evacuation succeeded.
and the recording was brief
the council's
and brutal,
containment fleet
and the
arrived
soldier had
36
perhaps 3 seconds
hours
to make
later
his decision
expecting
to find debris and corpses.
And he chose.
But instead
die
they found
so
human
4 others
ships
could
maintaining
live.
quarantine of
And
survivors.
Velcthor explained
and
that
running
humans
decontamination
heroism,
protocols,
and they
celebrated
celebrated
such
architects
acts psychological
and told
contamination
stories about them
using
for
methods they had
generations.
invented in the last 2
The
days.
statistical analysis
The display showed
appeared on
Dr.
the
Nathan
display,
Cross, who was a
showing
human
thousands
neurologist,
of similar
presenting his
incidents
findings to shock
across
galactic
human history.
medical teams.
And Velcthor explained that his
explained
research
that
team
architect
had run simulations to predict what would happen if humanity ever unified and turned their attention outward to the galaxy.
And adaptive,
and every simulation
developed a
ended the
treatment
same way
protocol
with
using
human-induced
vessels
coma
spreading
and
across
neural
space
reset
like a
procedures
geometric
and targeted
progression,
memory suppression,
adapting and learning
and
and growing
92%
at rates
of
that seemed
survivors were showing
impossible.
complete recovery.
a galactic
The projections showed human territory expanding not through military conquest,
answered that yet
but through a combination of exploration, and trade and cultural exchange, and most disturbingly through a tendency to help other species,
civilizations,
even when doing so provided no immediate benefit.
to with immediate.
And Velcthor explained that humans seemed to operate on emotional imperatives that overrode
46 hours, humans
survival
developed
logic
a
in
cure
your recording began
and
playing,
executed a successful
showed a
rescue
human woman
operation
named Captain
and
Nicole
neutralized
Brandt,
the threat with
commanding a
acceptable
vessel that had
casualties.
suffered catastrophic
He pulled
damage,
up comparative
and
analysis,
she calmly
showing
explained that they had
in
lost
70
containment
million
on
years
their
of galactic
antimatter
history,
systems,
and
the council had
encountered
estimated 7
architect
minutes until
contamination
cascade
47
failure,
times,
and she ordered
with a
evacuation
survival
of
rate
all
of
non-essential
0%.
personnel.
But humanity's
The recording
survival rate
continued
on
with
first
30
encounter
seconds of silence
was
before
89%.
Captain Grant spoke again.
The chamber fell
and said she would stay
silent
behind
as delegates
to maintain
absorbed this
reactor
information.
stability.
But
Because
Velcthor
someone
said what
had
truly
to, or the
frightened
blast
him
would
came
destroy
after
the
Helios'
entire
station
evacuation
when the
convoy.
council offered humans
And she told someone
every
to tell
piece
her
of
son
research
she
they
loved
had
him,
on architect
and that she bought
technology,
them time to make it
representing
home.
millions of years of
Velcthor
accumulated
paused the
knowledge,
recording
and humans
explained
thanked them
that
and then
Captain
asked one
Grant
question.
had a 93%
The message
chance of
appeared on
survival
the
if she
display
evacuated
asking,
immediately.
"Where can we find
But
more
she
of them?"
chose certain death to buy
Velcthor
8
said
additional
humans
minutes for her
wanted to
crew,
hunt architects,
and all
and they wanted to
217
find these
personnel
reality
survived
eating
because of her
monsters.
sacrifice. And either
The display
communicate
showed
with them
file
or destroy
after file
them,
of similar
and
incidents,
they were planning
Velcthor
expeditions
explained
into
that
dead
these were
space
just
zones
examples
the council
from the
had
past
avoided
70
for
years,
eons, and a
and
complete
they were
list
asking
would take
which
days to
species
review.
wanted to help,
And the pattern was
Valnari
clear
delegate
that humans routinely
said with a
sacrificed
shaking
themselves
voice
for
that
others
humans were insane.
in ways that made no
Velcthor
logical
said
sense
perhaps
from
they
a
were
pure
insane,
survival perspective,
or perhaps they saw a
but the
threat to
moment that
galactic
truly made
civilization
Velcthor
and refused to
understand the
ignore
threat
it,
humanity
and
posed
refused to simply
came
hide
during
and
one
hope
of
it
their
went
civil
away.
conflicts. He pulled
And
up
the
one
image
final
showed a small
document
child,
issued by the
perhaps
human
6
government
years
3
old,
months after
standing
Helios,
before an armored
soldier
station,
pointing a weapon at her.
The declaration was
direct
direct
and
simple,
simple, saying
flower.
that humanity
The next
pledged to
image showed
respond
the
to any
soldier on his
architect
knees with his
incursion
weapon
anywhere in
discarded,
known space,
and tears
and
running
they would
down
not
his face.
abandon anyone, and they
And
would not
Velcthor
write
explained
anyone
that
off
the
as
soldier
acceptable
had
losses,
orders to clear that
and
street
signed
by any
the
means necessary.
United Earth government
And
and
his
allied
faction had
colonies
committed
Velcthor
documented atrocities.
said they promised to protect
But this
everyone,
single
and not
moment
just their
with a
own
child
people,
offering
but
a
everyone.
flower
Made
and a
him
species
defect.
barely 2 centuries
The
into
child's
space
name
travel
was Sophie Martin,
was pledging to defend
and she died 3
civilizations
weeks
millions
later
of years
from disease,
older
but her
than
actions
themselves.
sparked a
He
cascade
concluded
that
by
ended
saying
a
the most
6-year
terrifying
war.
part was
And
that he believed
Velcthor
them.
said this demonstrated
And after
something
Helios
terrifying
Station,
about humanity,
and after everything he had
and
seen,
that was their ability
he
to change
believed
hearts and
humans would
minds
actually try,
through simple
and
acts
knowing
of kindness
humans
or courage.
they might even
turn to
succeed.
face the council directly. The
And
council
said that
chamber had
humans
been in
were
session
weapons
for
that
6
didn't know
hours
they were
without
weapons,
break,
and
and
they
their
were
delegate
vectors
had
of
left
change,
because the weight
who
of Velcthor's
transformed everything they
presentation hung
touched.
over them, and they
Like
were
a physical
survivors who
presence that
thrived in
demanded their
conditions that
complete
would break
attention.
any other
And
species.
finally,
And most terrifying
Speaker
of all, they
Tracy
didn't believe
spoke
they were
with his
special
ancient
or unique,
voice.
carrying
The
weariness
display showed
accumulated
modern
over
Earth
centuries.
with cities of glass
He
and
said that
steel, and
Velcthor
ships
had
departing
shown them
for
much
distant
about
stars
humanity,
and
children
persistence
playing in
and
courage,
courage.
and Velcthor
their
said
disturbing willingness to
humanity
die
was
for
entering
others.
the galactic stage
But he
with quantum
reminded the
communication
historian
and
that
ships that
the
rivaled
presentation
council
began
vessels
by
in speed,
saying no species
and they were
terrified
making
him more.
contact with neighboring
Yet
species.
everything shown suggested
kept asking
humans
the
would
same
be
questions
ideal
about
allies.
why humans acted
So why
the way they
terror
did.
Velcthor
had been
voice
waiting for
dropped
this
low as
question,
he concluded this
and he pulled
section.
up a final
And
series
he
of
said he
files
still
marked
wasn't
with the
certain anyone
highest
truly understood
classification
humanity.
level. And he
But
said
the
he
data
hadn't
showed
yet
one
told them
clear
what
pattern,
humans were capable
and
of
that
when they
was,
were truly angry.
if humanity ever perceived
display
a genuine
shifted to
threat
show
to
a
their
small
survival,
frontier world
they
called New
wouldn't
Vancouver
surrender
with a human
and they
colony
wouldn't
population of
negotiate,
43,000,
and they would fight with a
mostly
ferocity that
families
made ancient
and warrior
researchers
races
and
look
agricultural
cautious,
specialists,
and they would never
and
stop.
it was a peaceful